My name is Hannah. I am 34, and on Christmas night, Robert and Clara locked me out of their house in the snow and would not let me back in for so much as a coat. I stood on the porch with my purse on my shoulder and nothing else. Through the gap in the door, Clara said the thing she had been saying my whole life. You cannot do anything on your own. Hannah, you are desperate. Behind her, Silas pulled the curtain shut in what used to be my room. The next morning, I drove to the bank to check an old account my mentor Lucas had helped me set up years ago, just hoping for enough gas money and a cheap motel. The manager swiped my card, looked at her screen, and went white. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please sit down. You need to see this." 48 hours later, Clara was not the one giving orders anymore. Welcome back to my channel, where the daughter they locked out on Christmas night turns out to be the one holding everything they never knew they had. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is. And be sure to subscribe. If you have ever been called desperate by the very people who were leaning on you the hardest, stay right here, because what that bank manager found on her screen changes everything. It changes absolutely everything. The air conditioning in the manager's office hummed quietly. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and the world outside was still frozen from the Christmas storm. The bank manager turned her monitor around so I could see the screen. $45 million. The acquisition of the medical supply company I had helped build from the ground up had officially finalized in the early hours of the morning. My equity shares had converted into liquid cash. The funds had cleared. I sat in my cheap, thin winter coat and stared at the numbers. Most people would have cried. They would have screamed, jumped up and down, or frantically dialed their family to share the news. I did none of those things. Crying is a luxury for people who have a safety net, and I had never been afforded one. I simply asked the manager for a glass of tap water. She brought it to me with shaking hands, clearly overwhelmed by the screen in front of her. I took a slow sip. My mind was completely and utterly clear. I opened my purse and pulled out a heavy blue folder. Inside were the irrevocable trust documents my mentor Lucas had insisted I prepare 6 months ago when the buyout rumors first started. I slid the thick stack of papers across the mahogany desk. I told the manager calmly that we needed to move the entire balance into this trust immediately. No one else gets access. Just me. She nodded rapidly and started typing furiously on her keyboard, initiating the transfers. I sat there watching the progress bar on her screen. I thought about the bitter cold on Robert and Clara's porch 12 hours earlier. I thought about Silas's smug, satisfied face in the window as he watched me freeze. They had spent 3 decades treating me like a disposable draft version of a human being. They always assumed Silas was the future king of their little empire, while I was just a peasant meant to serve him. They did not know their precious kingdom was built on a crumbling foundation of debt. And they certainly did not know that by Saturday evening, I would be the only person capable of saving them. But the $45 million was not even the most important thing on my mind. As I signed the final transfer authorization with a steady hand, my thoughts shifted to a pair of tight plastic shoes. The only thing I truly cared about in that house was 7-year-old Fair, Silas's daughter. She had watched them lock me out. I had seen her tiny, terrified face peeking from the hallway before Silas yanked the curtains closed. I had $45 million working for me now. The paperwork was legally sealed and untouchable. I owned the chessboard now. 48 hours passed. It was 7:30 in the evening. The crystal chandeliers at the upscale downtown restaurant cast a warm, golden glow over the private dining room. It was Robert and Clara's 40th wedding anniversary. I walked in wearing a plain navy blazer and standard work slacks, blending into the background just as they always expected me to. The room was already buzzing with aunts, uncles, and cousins holding expensive champagne flutes. At the center of the room stood Silas. He was holding a glass of aged scotch, laughing loudly, completely soaking in the admiration of our extended relatives. Robert and Clara were practically glowing, standing proudly by his side. My aunt marched right up to me as soon as I walked through the heavy oak doors. She immediately started gushing about how generous and successful Silas was. She told me how he had rented out this entire private room, ordered the premium seafood towers, and paid for the top-tier open bar. She leaned in and whispered that I should be proud to have a brother who takes such magnificent care of his parents. I smiled politely. I nodded in agreement. I did not correct her. I did not tell her that Silas's credit cards had been declined twice that morning when the restaurant tried to run the deposit. I did not mention the frantic phone call the banquet manager had made to the emergency contact on file just 4 hours ago. That emergency contact was me. I had quietly walked into the restaurant before anyone arrived and swiped my own card to cover the entire $12,000 bill. I paid for the champagne they were drinking. I paid for the seafood towers they were eating. I let them believe the lie. Clara caught my eye from across the room. She looked me up and down, her lips thinning as she noted my modest clothes. She turned back to Silas, resting a loving hand on his shoulder. They were so incredibly proud of their golden boy. It was a beautiful, elaborate stage play, and they were the star performers. But I was the one who had bought the theater. I took a quiet seat near the back corner of the room, far away from the center of attention. I watched them perform their perfect family routine. I knew exactly what was hiding beneath Silas's expensive suit and Robert's forced laughter. The financial ruin they were desperately trying to conceal was ticking like a clock in the background. They thought tonight was a celebration of their legacy. They had no idea it was actually the final curtain call for their delusions. I just sipped my water. Silas was holding court at the head of the long dining table. He kept rolling up his crisp white sleeve to make sure everyone saw the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He claimed it was a rare, vintage Rolex. He announced to the table that his new tech venture was booming and he wanted to treat himself to something special. I recognized the misaligned bezel and the cheap glare of the glass from across the room. It was a terrible fake, but no one else noticed. They were too busy hanging on his every word, treating him like a visionary. While Silas boasted about his imaginary wealth, my eyes drifted away from the crowd and settled on the corner of the room. Sitting completely alone at a small side table was Faye. She was 7 years old. She was wearing a faded pink dress that was at least 2 sizes too small. The fabric pulled uncomfortably tight across her narrow shoulders. What caught my attention, and absolutely broke my heart, were her shoes. They were cheap, stiff plastic flats. I could see her heels bulging over the rigid edges, the skin red and blistered from being squeezed into something she had outgrown a full year ago. She was quietly gnawing on a dry crust of bread, keeping her head down, trying desperately not to draw any attention to herself. Silas had fought aggressively for full custody of Faye when he divorced his wife 2 years ago. He didn't do it out of love. He did it to collect state child support and to punish his ex-wife in court. Once the legal papers were signed, he dumped the child on Robert and Clara. And when they got tired of dealing with her, she was left to me. I was the one who bought her groceries. I paid her preschool fees. I took her to the clinic when she had a fever in the middle of the night. Silas played the devoted single father on social media, posting photos of her on holidays to gather likes. But in reality, he could not even be bothered to buy his daughter shoes that fit her feet. I watched Faye rub her sore, blistered heel against the carpet. My chest tightened with a quiet, calculated resolve. Silas was laughing, raising his glass for another toast. He had no idea what was sitting inside my purse. He didn't know that the legal documents resting against my wallet were about to change his entire existence. And more importantly, they were going to dictate exactly who would become the legal guardian of that little girl. He thought he was untouchable. He was terribly, completely wrong. You might be wondering why I stayed around for so long. Why did I let them treat me like a glorified bank machine and a live-in nanny without walking away to understand that? You have to understand how a family scapegoat is manufactured. It does not happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical process of breaking down your self-worth until you genuinely believe you deserve the crumbs they throw at you. Let me take you back to when I was 16 years old. That was the year Silas turned 18. For his birthday, Robert and Clara threw a massive outdoor party. They hired a professional catering company. They invited the entire neighborhood to celebrate. The grand finale of the afternoon was a brand new sports car parked in the driveway with a giant red bow resting on the hood. People cheered loudly. Clara cried tears of absolute joy. It was a royal coronation for the favorite son. 2 years later, on my 16th birthday, I woke up to a silent house. There was no party. There was no cake. Robert tossed a pair of keys on the kitchen counter while he was putting on his work shoes. He pointed lazily toward the garage. Inside was a rusty, second-hand bicycle he had found on an online classified site. The chain was bright orange with rust. The seat was broken and tilted permanently to the left. When I quietly pointed out that the seat was broken and dangerous, Robert did not even look up from tying his shoelaces. He told me that riding a broken bike would build character. He said I needed to learn the harsh value of hard work, while Silas was busy driving his pristine car to private tutoring sessions. The contrast was not just unfair. It was a psychological trap. This is the cruelty of normalization. When you are told from the time you can walk that your brother is a genius and you are just the rough draft, you internalize it deeply. You start working twice as hard just to get a brief nod of approval. You accept the rusty bicycle because a part of your brain has been trained to believe that is exactly what you are worth. You become addicted to the tiny, rare scraps of validation they offer. I spent my entire youth trying to prove I was worthy of their basic love. I thought if I was just useful enough, responsible enough, and quiet enough, they would finally see me as a daughter. It was a pathetic illusion. When it was time for college, the golden child treatment reached an entirely new level of absurdity. Silas barely graduated high school. He had terrible grades and no work ethic. Yet, Robert and Clara were absolutely convinced their special boy belonged at a prestigious private university. They gladly paid $45,000 a year in tuition. They paid for his luxury dormitory, his premium meal plan, and his endless spring break trips to tropical beaches. Over 4 years, they easily dropped more than $200,000 on his so-called education. Silas spent that time joining a fraternity, partying every weekend, and failing basic economics twice. Whenever he ran out of spending money, he simply made a phone call, and Clara would rush to deposit more funds into his account. They called it investing in his bright future. My college experience was entirely different. When I received my acceptance letter to a solid state university, Robert looked at it, nodded once, and told me to figure out my own student loans. I received exactly $0 from my parents. To survive, I took a full course load during the day and worked the night shift at a massive medical supply warehouse. My shift started at 10 o'clock at night and ended at 6 in the morning. The warehouse was heavily air-conditioned to preserve medical materials, meaning it was freezing cold all year round. I spent my nights lifting heavy boxes of saline bags, scanning barcodes, and organizing inventory on towering metal racks. My hands were permanently calloused. My back constantly ached. I survived on cheap instant noodles and day-old bagels from the campus cafeteria. While Silas was posting photos of himself drinking expensive cocktails on boats, I was coming back to a tiny, damp apartment smelling like cardboard, industrial tape, and sweat. I would sleep for maybe 4 hours before dragging myself to my morning lectures. My family viewed my warehouse job with absolute disgust. Whenever someone asked what I was doing, Clara would quickly change the subject, clearly embarrassed that her daughter was doing manual labor. They thought I was just a mindless worker moving boxes in the dark. They had no idea that those brutal night shifts were teaching me exactly how a complex supply chain operated from the ground up. I was learning the fatal flaws in distribution logistics while Silas was learning how to nurse a hangover. I was quietly building a foundation of resilience that no amount of their money could ever buy. They thought the warehouse was my punishment. It taught me everything. They assumed I would eventually burn out. They thought the heavy lifting and the endless exhaustion would force me to quit school and crawl back to them, begging for a small handout. But the cold warehouse did the exact opposite. It hardened my focus. Every time I picked up a heavy box, I promised myself I would never depend on Robert or Clara for a single thing. I watched how the warehouse managers tracked inventory, noting their inefficiencies. I studied the shipping manifests during my break times. I started seeing patterns in the chaos. I realized that the medical supply industry was incredibly lucrative, but severely outdated in its logistics. While my family mocked my dirty fingernails and my cheap clothes, I was secretly mapping out a multi-million-dollar industry in my head. I was not just surviving the night shift. I was studying it. The cold made me sharp. I pulled my thoughts away from the past and refocused on the present moment. The anniversary party was in full swing. The waiters were clearing the expensive seafood platters that I had secretly paid for. Silas suddenly pushed his chair back, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He caught my eye across the room and gave a sharp, demanding nod toward the private outdoor balcony. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. I picked up my glass of water and walked outside into the cool evening air. The balcony was empty, shielded from the noise of the party by heavy glass doors. Silas dropped his charming smile the second the doors clicked shut. His face was pale, and his hands were slightly shaking. The fake Rolex on his wrist caught the dim patio light. He did not bother with small talk. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. He told me his new digital startup was in serious trouble. He had borrowed a massive amount of money from some highly questionable private investors, and they were demanding immediate repayment. He needed $500,000 by Monday morning to keep his business afloat and keep these people away from him. I just stood there, looking at him calmly. I asked him what any of that had to do with me. Silas's eyes narrowed into angry slits. He demanded that I take out a second mortgage on my apartment. He knew I had good credit and a stable job. He ordered me to secure a loan and hand the cash over to him immediately. He actually called it a temporary family loan. I took a slow sip of my water. I told him no. I spoke softly, without a single trace of emotion. I said I would not risk my home for his gambling debts. Silas's face twisted into something ugly and vicious. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. When he realized I was not backing down, he pulled out his ultimate weapon. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and hissed his threat. If I did not get him that money, he would permanently cut off my access to fare. He knew I was the only person who actually cared for that little girl. He knew I took her to the park, bought her clothes, and made sure she ate. He smiled a cruel, cold smile. He promised me I would never see my niece again unless I signed the mortgage papers. He thought he had trapped me. He played the wrong card. I did not gasp. I did not beg him to reconsider. I simply stared at his desperate, sweating face. It is a fascinating thing to watch a bully realize his intimidation tactics are hitting a solid brick wall. Silas expected me to cry. He expected me to panic at the thought of losing fare. For years, he had used that little girl as a pawn to extract favors from our parents. And now he was trying to use her to extract $500,000 from me. He leaned against the balcony railing, looking extremely smug, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. He assumed my silence was a sign of surrender. He thought I was mentally calculating how fast I could get the bank document signed. Instead, I was calculating exactly how many hours he had left before his entire fraudulent existence collapsed. I looked past his shoulder, through the glass doors, and saw Faye sitting alone at that side table, still rubbing her blistered foot. I made a silent promise to her right then and there. His threat sealed his fate. Before I could respond to Silas's disgusting threat, the heavy glass balcony doors slid open. Robert and Clara walked out, holding their champagne flutes. They had noticed our private conversation and decided to intervene. From the deep scowl on Robert's face and the anxious fluttering of Clara's hands, I knew Silas had already briefed them on his financial disaster. They formed a tight half-circle around me, trapping me against the edge of the balcony. It was the classic family dynamic playing out in real time. The three of them united against the single, disposable scapegoat. Clara spoke first, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She told me that family always steps up in times of crisis. She said Silas was on the verge of building a massive legacy for all of us, and it was my duty as a sister to help him cross the finish line. I asked her if helping him cross the finish line meant risking my own home so he could pay off shady investors. Robert slammed his hand down on the metal patio table, making the glasses rattle. He raised his voice, lecturing me about selfishness. He pointed his finger at my chest and told me I was just a mid-level corporate employee with no real ambitions. He said I had no husband, no children, and no grand vision for the future. In his eyes, my modest apartment was a perfectly acceptable sacrifice to save his son's imaginary empire. He demanded that I go to the bank on Monday morning and do whatever Silas instructed. Clara started crying fake tears, begging me not to tear the family apart over something as trivial as money. They were actively participating in the extortion. They were completely willing to throw me to the wolves to protect their golden boy. I looked through the glass again. Fair was still sitting by herself. Someone had bumped into her table, knocking her small cup of juice onto her lap. She was desperately trying to wipe it up with a napkin, looking terrified that she would be yelled at. Neither her father nor her grandparents even noticed. They were too busy trying to steal my home. My chest felt incredibly light. The last invisible thread of guilt I had ever felt toward these people simply snapped. If you have ever had to protect a defenseless child from the toxicity of your own family, you know exactly what I was feeling at that moment. Hit the like button if you are with me, because what happens next is for every scapegoat who ever fought back. I looked back at Robert, Clara, and Silas. I did not argue. I did not defend my career or my life choices. I just smoothed the lapel of my navy blazer. I was ready to strike. The sheer audacity of their demands was almost breathtaking. They truly believed I owed them my life. They believed that because they had provided the bare biological minimum of giving birth to me, I was forever bound by a contract of indentured servitude to Silas. Clara reached out and tried to grab my hand, putting on a sickeningly sweet motherly face. She whispered that if I just signed the loan papers, we could all go back inside and cut the anniversary cake together as a happy family. I calmly pulled my hand away from her grasp. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. Anger requires attachment, and I was completely detached. I was looking at 3 strangers who had accidentally shared my mailing address for 18 years. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch out until Silas started shifting uncomfortably on his feet. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin. They just did not realize I already owned the casino. I smiled very politely. To understand how I reached this point of absolute calm, you need to know what I was doing while Silas was failing at life. After graduating from my state university, I did not stop working. I took a low-paying logistics job at a struggling medical tech startup. The company had brilliant medical software, but their supply chain was a complete nightmare. Shipments were delayed, inventory was lost, and they were bleeding cash. I started working 80-hour weeks. I spent my days restructuring their entire distribution network and my nights negotiating new contracts with carriers. I applied everything I had learned during those freezing night shifts in the warehouse. I did not ask for a massive salary. Instead, I quietly negotiated for a solid percentage of equity in the company. My family mocked my long hours. Robert used to laugh and tell his friends I was basically a glorified delivery dispatcher. What Robert did not know was that the CEO of the startup, a man named Lucas, saw exactly what I was doing. Lucas was a 60-year-old widower who had built the company from scratch. He was the first person in my entire life who ever looked at my work and told me it was exceptional. He noticed the permanent calluses on my hands from my warehouse days. He did not mock them. He respected them. Lucas became the father figure I never had. He taught me how to read complex financial statements. He taught me how corporate acquisitions worked. Most importantly, he taught me my own value. When the company finally stabilized and our profits skyrocketed, Lucas promoted me to director of supply chain. My equity shares became incredibly valuable. I kept driving my old car and living in my quiet apartment. I never said a word to my family about my success. Lucas used to tell me that wealth speaks, but true power whispers. He understood my family dynamic because I had eventually told him the truth about Silas. Lucas advised me to keep my empire completely hidden. He knew that if Robert and Clara found out about my money, they would relentlessly try to drain it to fund Silas's delusions. So, I built my fortune in complete silence. I aggressively invested my bonuses into diversified index funds and municipal bonds. I learned everything about tax law and asset protection. I was managing a supply chain worth tens of millions of dollars during the day, and sitting through agonizing family dinners at night where I was treated like a failure. It was the perfect camouflage. Lucas gave me the tools to build a fortress, and he gave me the confidence to lock the gate. He gave me a future. Tragically, Lucas's health began to fail about 2 years ago. Even as he grew weaker, his mind remained incredibly sharp. We would sit in his office, going over acquisition offers from massive healthcare conglomerates that wanted to buy our technology. He made sure I was involved in every high-level negotiation. He wanted me to understand exactly how much my equity was worth. He treated me with a level of dignity and respect that Robert and Clara had actively denied me my entire life. When Lucas finally passed away, it broke my heart, but he did not leave me empty-handed. He left me with a brilliant corporate strategy and a very specific set of instructions regarding my personal wealth. He knew the buyout was inevitable, and he knew my family would eventually show their true colors. He told me to prepare my armor before the battle even started. His wisdom was my shield. 6 months ago, the rumors of a corporate buyout became a guaranteed reality. A Fortune 500 medical corporation made a massive offer for our startup. I knew my equity was about to convert into an enormous amount of liquid cash. I also knew that wealth of this magnitude could not be hidden forever. Following Lucas's final advice, I quietly hired a top-tier wealth management attorney. Together, we established an irrevocable trust. This is a very specific, ironclad legal structure. Once my money went into that trust, it was no longer legally my personal property. It belonged to the trust, which I controlled as the sole trustee. It meant that absolutely no one, not a sibling, not a parent, not a fraudulent lawsuit could pierce that financial armor. The $45 million was legally bulletproof, but I didn't stop at financial protection. I knew Silas's erratic behavior was escalating. I was deeply worried about Fair's safety. So, I used a fraction of my early bonuses to hire a licensed private investigator. I needed to know exactly what Silas was doing when he was pretending to be a tech CEO. The investigator's report was comprehensive and absolutely devastating. Silas was not running a business. He was running a massive illegal gambling debt. He had borrowed heavily from loan sharks and unregulated crypto lenders. But the most horrifying discovery was a specific notarized document the investigator pulled from the county records. Silas had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on Robert and Clara's house. He had forged their signatures to use their only asset as collateral for his terrible crypto bets. The bank was already preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings on my parents' home. I kept all of this information perfectly organized in a heavy blue folder. I had the bank statements, the forged signatures, the gambling ledgers, and a mountain of photographic evidence proving Silas's gross negligence regarding Fair. He regularly left her alone in a dirty apartment while he went out drinking. The file was a loaded weapon, sitting quietly in the bottom of my work purse. I did not confront them. I did not warn them. I simply went to work, drank my coffee, and waited. When they locked me out of the house in the freezing snow on Christmas night, calling me a desperate failure, I did not panic. I just touched the leather edge of my purse. I knew exactly what was coming. I knew that the moment my company's buyout officially closed, I would hold the absolute power to destroy Silas's false reality. The trap was completely set. The beauty of a well-prepared legal trap is that it requires absolutely no emotion to spring. You do not need to scream, or cry, or throw plates against a wall. You just need the right documents, signed by the right people, at the right time. Every time Clara sent me a passive-aggressive text message about how I needed to support Silas more, I simply added it to the digital file. Every time Silas posted a fake picture of his expensive lifestyle online, I cross-referenced it with his growing mountain of debt. I was building a comprehensive dossier of their toxicity. I was securing Fair's escape route. I spent 6 months making sure there was not a single legal loophole Silas could crawl through when the time came. I made sure Robert and Clara would have to face the cold, undeniable proof of the monster they had created and enabled. They thought they were the ones in control of the family narrative. They had no idea they were just walking blindly into a meticulously designed legal execution. Documentation is true justice. I turned my back on them and walked off the balcony, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind me. The cool night air was instantly replaced by the warm, buzzing atmosphere of the anniversary party. I walked straight to my small table in the corner and sat down, picking up my glass of water. A few seconds later, Silas strutted back into the dining room, followed closely by Robert and Clara. Silas had a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He adjusted his expensive, tailored suit jacket and ran a hand through his hair. He truly believed he had won. He assumed my silence on the balcony was the silence of a broken, defeated woman who was already calculating how fast she could get to the bank on Monday. He thought his threat regarding Fair had paralyzed me. To celebrate his imaginary victory, Silas grabbed a silver spoon and tapped it loudly against his crystal champagne flute. The room quieted down. The aunts, uncles, and cousins all turned their attention to the golden child. Silas raised his glass high and launched into a grandiose, obnoxious speech. He started by praising Robert and Clara for 40 years of marriage. But within 30 seconds, he made this speech entirely about himself. He talked about his visionary mindset. He boasted about his decentralized finance startup and how he was building generational wealth for the family name. He used buzzwords like blockchain, digital assets, and market disruption, stringing them together in a way that sounded impressive to our aging relatives, but meant absolutely nothing. Then, he made his fatal mistake. He could not resist the urge to publicly humiliate me one more time. He gestured toward my table with a condescending smile. He told the entire room that everyone has a different role in the family. He said some people are born to be leaders and visionaries, while others, like his dear sister Hannah, are meant to be the reliable, hardworking background characters. He literally told the room that it was perfectly fine that I just managed shipping boxes in a warehouse, because every empire needs its manual laborers. Robert and Clara nodded in strong agreement, beaming with pride at their son's profound wisdom. The relatives chuckled politely, casting pitying glances in my direction. I sat perfectly still. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not lower my eyes. I simply watched him perform. He was standing on a stage built entirely of lies, actively handing me the matches to burn it down. He was digging his own grave. I let him finish his arrogant toast. I listened to the applause echoing off the expensive wallpaper. I watched Clara wipe a tear of pride from her cheek, completely oblivious to the fact that the champagne she was drinking had been paid for by the very daughter they were currently laughing at. Silas walked over to the main table, soaking in the praise, clapping his uncles on the back. He looked over at me and gave a sharp, commanding nod, signaling that he expected me to fall in line and confirm my financial submission to the rest of the family. He wanted me to publicly commit to the loan. He wanted the ultimate display of dominance. I slowly unzipped the top of my leather purse. I felt the smooth, heavy cardstock of the blue folder resting inside. I had spent my entire life biting my tongue to keep the peace in this family. I had spent 34 years absorbing their insults, their neglect, and their endless demands. But peace was no longer an option. It was time for the truth. Robert cleared his throat loudly, drawing the room's attention again. He looked directly at me with a stern, authoritative expression. He announced to the extended family that Hannah had some wonderful news to share. He said I had graciously agreed to leverage my apartment to provide some seed capital for Silas's expanding business. He called it a beautiful demonstration of family loyalty. The relatives murmured in approval, looking at me with a mix of surprise and mild respect. Silas leaned against the table, crossing his arms, waiting for me to speak my lines like a well-trained dog. I stood up slowly. I picked up my purse, opened it, and pulled out the heavy blue folder. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in the exact same clear, measured tone I used during quarterly board meetings. I said there seemed to be a slight misunderstanding. I told the room that I would not be mortgaging my apartment because Silas did not need seed capital. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of notarized documents. I looked directly at Robert and Clara. I explained that Silas was currently $500,000 in debt to unregulated private lenders. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Silas's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. He lunged forward, shouting that I was lying, telling me to shut my mouth. I stepped back smoothly, avoiding his grasp, and placed the documents directly onto the center of the dining table. But I was not finished. I told Robert that the $500,000 debt was actually the least of his problems. I slid a specific piece of paper toward him. It was a copy of a secondary mortgage agreement. I told Robert to look very closely at the signatures at the bottom of the page. I explained that 3 months ago, Silas had forged both of their signatures and secretly pledged their fully paid-off home as collateral to cover his massive crypto trading losses. I watched the blood drain completely from Robert's face as he recognized the document. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings on Monday. Clara let out a sharp, choked noise, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. The house she loved, the house she had lived in for 30 years, was gone. If you have ever watched the people who sacrificed your well-being for a golden child suddenly realize they have been betrayed by their own favorite, tell me how you would feel in the comments. Would you save them? Because as I stood there, watching their world crumble, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of justice. Silas was stammering, trying to invent a lie, trying to say it was a temporary market dip and he was going to win the house back. But the notarized ink on the page was undeniable. The relatives were staring at him in absolute horror. The illusion shattered completely. The silence in the room was suffocating. You could hear the faint hum of the restaurant's ventilation system. Clara's hands were trembling so violently that she knocked over her water glass. It spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric, but no one moved to wipe it up. Robert picked up the forged deed with shaking fingers. He stared at his own falsified signature, his mind struggling to process the reality of his favorite son's betrayal. He looked at Silas, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading hope that this was just some elaborate prank. But Silas could not meet his father's gaze. The golden boy was staring at the floor, sweating profusely, looking like a cornered animal. For decades, they had built a fortress of denial around Silas, ignoring every red flag, excusing every failure, and funding every mistake. They had used me as the foundation to keep his fantasy alive. Now, the foundation had simply walked away, and the fortress was collapsing directly onto their heads. I watched the ruins fall. The heavy silence was finally broken by my uncle. He was a retired accountant, and usually the only pragmatic person in our extended family. He stepped forward, putting on his reading glasses, and carefully reviewed the documents I had placed on the table. He nodded slowly, verifying the catastrophic financial reality. Then, he looked up at me with genuine concern. He asked me a very logical question. He said, "Hannah, if the bank forecloses on their house this week, and Silas is in this much trouble, how are you going to protect yourself? You only make a modest salary at that warehouse. If they lose everything, they are going to come living with you. How are you going to survive this?" I looked at my uncle. I appreciated his practical concern, but it was time to correct the final misconception of the evening. I reached into my purse one last time and pulled out my tablet. I told him I did not work in a warehouse anymore. I explained that for the past 10 years, I had been the director of supply chain for a rapidly growing medical technology firm. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure banking application that the manager had helped me set up just 2 days ago. I also opened the official corporate press release announcing the finalization of our company's acquisition by a major healthcare conglomerate. I placed the tablet on the table, right next to Silas's forged mortgage documents. I told the room that my equity shares had converted into liquid assets on Friday morning. The screen glowed brightly against the dim lighting of the restaurant. My uncle leaned in, squinting at the numbers. He froze. He took his glasses off, wiped them on his shirt, put them back on, and looked again. He read the number out loud, his voice cracking slightly. $45 million. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Robert's head snapped up. Clara stopped crying for a split second, her mouth hanging open. Silas stared at the tablet as if it were an alien artifact. I stood tall, keeping my posture relaxed, but completely unyielding. I confirmed it. $45 million, after taxes, fully cleared and secured. The contrast between the two pieces of paper on the table was poetic. On the left was the absolute destruction of Silas's fake empire, documented in debt and forgery. On the right was the undeniable proof of the quiet, relentless empire I had built in the shadows. For 34 years, they had called me desperate. They had called me a failure. They had locked me out in the snow because they thought I was a burden who could not survive without their meager charity. They had vastly underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. The numbers spoke for themselves. I did not gloat. I did not rub the screen in their faces or shout about how wrong they had been. True power does not need to raise its voice. I simply let the glowing digits on the screen do all the heavy lifting. I watched their brains short-circuit as they tried to reconcile the image of the obedient, invisible daughter with the reality of a multimillionaire standing in front of them. The cousins who had been snickering at my plain clothes just minutes ago were now staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep intimidation. Silas looked physically sick. The fake Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked even cheaper compared to the quiet, verified wealth resting on the table. He had spent his entire life trying to project an image of success through lies and stolen money. I had spent my life actually doing the work. Reality had finally arrived. Silas was the first one to snap out of the shock. His panic rapidly morphed into a desperate, frantic negotiation tactic. He rushed around the table, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He started talking incredibly fast, telling me that this was actually a blessing in disguise. He claimed he could take a few million from my account, pay off the loan sharks, save the parents' house from foreclosure, and then invest the rest into his crypto platform. He swore he would double my money within a year. He begged me to just sign a power of attorney and let him handle the finances so we could save the family. Don't just stand there with that blank, stupid look on your face. Hannah, Silas snapped, the charming facade instantly cracking to reveal the sneering bully underneath. He jabbed a finger in my direction. This is exactly why you need me to take control. You're a glorified warehouse worker. For God's sake, you don't know the first thing about managing this kind of capital. You'll lose it all to taxes. Or worse, you'll get scammed by someone who actually knows how the world works. I am a CEO. I have the network. You sign that power of attorney right now, and I'll even let you stay in the guest house when I buy my new estate. If you don't do this, you're not just destroying my life. You're throwing mom and dad out onto the street. Are you really that pathetic? Are you really that vindictive? Are you gonna let your own niece starve because you're still holding some childish, petty grudge about a rusty bicycle? Grow up and do your job for this family. I looked at him with absolute clinical detachment. When you understand the law and the strict mechanics of financial processes, you do not cry. You do not argue with a narcissist. You simply present the concrete walls they are about to crash into. I told him he was fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. I explained, using precise corporate terminology, that the $45 million was not sitting in a standard checking account. I had established an irrevocable trust 6 months ago. I explained that under state law, an irrevocable trust removes the assets from my personal taxable estate. It means I cannot arbitrarily withdraw millions of dollars to pay off the unsecured gambling debts of a third party without violating my own fiduciary duties. I watched his eyes widen as the legal terminology washed over him. I continued, dismantling his entire plan. I explained that the bank holding the forged mortgage on our parents' house would not accept a sudden, massive payoff from an outside trust without triggering a federal money laundering investigation, especially given his ties to unregulated crypto lenders. I told him that even if I wanted to help him, which I absolutely did not, the legal and financial firewalls I had built made it structurally impossible for him to touch a single penny of my money. This is the ultimate power of justice by documentation. It removes all emotion from the battlefield. You cannot manipulate a trust document. You cannot guilt-trip a legal statute. You cannot gaslight a bank's fraud department. Silas tried to argue, claiming that family overrides legal paperwork. He said a good lawyer could break the trust. I almost smiled. I told him that my mentor, Lucas, had used the most aggressive, bulletproof wealth protection firm in the state to draft those documents. I told Silas he was welcome to try and sue me, but he would be fighting a fortress with a wooden spoon. He realized, in that exact moment, that I had not just hidden my money. I had weaponized the legal system to ensure he could never, ever reach it. Paper trails do not lie. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy. It was explosive. Silas's face turned a mottled, furious red. The realization that he was permanently locked out of a $45 million gold mine shattered his fragile sanity. He slammed both his fists down onto the dining table, rattling the fine china and violently knocking over a crystal vase. Water and dying roses spilled across the white linen. "You spiteful, ugly little bitch!" he screamed, the venom flying from his lips, echoing harshly off the mahogany walls. The aunts and uncles gasped in horror. But Silas didn't care anymore. The mask was entirely gone. "You think you're better than me because of some freak stroke of luck? You are nothing. You have always been nothing. That money belongs to me. I'm the one who deserves it. I'm the one with the vision and the legacy. You're just a sad, lonely spinster who's going to die in a miserable, empty apartment with your stupid spreadsheets. You should have frozen to death on that porch." His voice cracked into a hysterical, ugly sob. He grabbed his own hair, pacing the room like a rabid animal. "Give it to me. It's mine. It's my birthright, you ungrateful parasite." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply watched him unravel, noting exactly how pathetic a king looks when his paper crown finally catches fire. The beauty of a meticulously crafted legal structure is that it operates entirely without empathy. It does not care if it is a holiday. It does not care if someone is crying. It only follows the ink on the page. I explained to Silas that the forensic accountants managing my trust would flag any transaction associated with his name as a high-risk liability. I had essentially financially quarantined him. He was a toxic asset, and I had built a balance sheet that explicitly excluded him. I watched his shoulders slump. The frantic energy drained out of his body as the cold, hard logic of the situation finally penetrated his delusions. He had spent his life manipulating human emotions to get what he wanted. But he had absolutely no idea how to manipulate a legally binding contract. He was out of his depth, out of money, and completely out of time. The trap was permanently locked. If you want to see the darkest depths of human nature, watch what happens when people who are facing absolute ruin suddenly realize they are standing next to a vault of cash. The shock of Silas's betrayal and the impending loss of their home faded from Robert and Clara's faces with terrifying speed. The despair was instantly replaced by a ravenous, calculating greed. Robert actually straightened his tie. He puffed out his chest, stepping away from Silas and moving toward me. He looked at the glowing tablet on the table, doing the mental math in his head. 45 million minus $500,000 to save the house left $44.5 million. In his mind, they were saved. In his mind, we were rich. Robert didn't just step toward me. He aggressively invaded my personal space, trying to use his physical size to reassert the patriarchal dominance he had wielded for 3 decades. He pointed a thick, demanding finger directly at my chest. "Now listen to me very closely. Young lady," he barked, slipping effortlessly back into his role as the absolute dictator of the household. "I don't care what fancy legal tricks your little mentor taught you. You will march into that bank on Monday morning, and you will dissolve this ridiculous trust. We are a family, and we pool our resources. I will not have my daughter hoarding wealth while her brother struggles. I am still the head of this family, and you will obey me." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his command, Clara pushed her way forward. Her eyes were glittering with a sickening, manic desperation. "Oh, Robert, don't be so harsh," she cooed, though her grip on my forearm was painfully tight, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging sharply into my skin. "Hannah knows she owes us. Honestly, sweetheart, you should be thanking us. If we hadn't been so hard on you all these years, if we hadn't pushed you out of your comfort zone on Christmas night, you wouldn't have this independent streak. We built your resilience. We made you this successful." She let out a breathless, delusional laugh, looking around the room as if expecting a round of applause for her excellent parenting. "We practically handed you this fortune by teaching you the harsh value of hard work. Now, we need to clear Silas's tiny little mistake and buy back the house. Oh, and I saw a gorgeous, sprawling property in the Hamptons last week that would be absolutely perfect for our family summer retreats. You can have the basement suite, of course, since you prefer quiet spaces." They weren't just demanding my money. They were actively trying to steal the credit for my survival, desperately rewriting the dark history of their abuse into a twisted, heroic narrative of tough love. Clara's transformation was even more sickening. The woman who had literally locked me out in the freezing snow less than 3 days ago suddenly burst into joyful tears. She rushed forward, attempting to throw her arms around my neck. She cried out that God had blessed our family. She said she always knew I was destined for greatness, and that my quiet dedication had finally paid off for all of us. She told the room that this was a miracle, that I could buy them a bigger house, pay off Silas's debts, and we could finally live the life they always deserved. She actually used the phrase, "our money." I stepped back quickly, refusing her embrace. I felt a wave of profound disgust wash over me. They were not apologizing for Silas's crimes. They were not expressing remorse for the decades of abuse they had put me through. They were simply pivoting their parasitism. They had drained Silas's potential until he became a criminal, and now they were eagerly turning their fangs toward me. Robert started listing demands, framing them as fatherly advice. He told me I needed to wire the $500,000 to Silas's creditors first thing in the morning to protect the family name, and then we would sit down with his financial advisor to discuss how to manage the rest of the portfolio. Have you ever witnessed someone's true colors flip so violently that it makes you physically nauseous? If you have dealt with a family of opportunistic vultures, leave a comment below. It is a terrifying thing to realize that your parents do not see you as a human being, but merely as a convenient financial resource. Silas was nodding along with them, his hope reignited. He thought the family dynamic would force me to comply. He thought the sheer pressure of Robert and Clara's expectations would break my resolve just like it always had when I was a child. They were circling me, their eyes wide with greed, ready to feast on the empire I had built. They were predators smelling blood. I stood my ground in the center of the room. The extended relatives were watching the spectacle in stunned silence. Some looked appalled by Robert and Clara's blatant greed, while others looked at me with expectation, assuming I would simply cave to the pressure. After all, that was the established script. Hannah always fixes the problems. Hannah always cleans up the mess. They expected me to sigh, pull out my checkbook, and purchase their affection, just like Silas had always done. But I was no longer the 16-year-old girl desperate for a word of praise over a rusty bicycle. I was a 34-year-old executive who had survived night shifts, corporate takeovers, and the brutal reality of the world. I looked at the three of them, the golden child and his enablers, and realized they had absolutely no leverage left. They had spent all their power, and I held all the capital. I took a deep breath,